Human Trafficking Laws by Molly Margraves, July 31st, 2020. What is trafficking? Human trafficking is also known as trafficking in person, TIP. It is a modern-day form of slavery. It is a crime under federal and international law. It is also a crime in every state in the United States according to the U.S. State Department. Sex trafficking, which is most common, can be defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, and soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act, in which the commercial act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform has not attained 18 years of age. Human trafficking can affect males and females. Now let's go over the laws and statutes associated. First is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, TVPA of 2000. The TVPA allows legal protection to be offered to any victim of human trafficking, regardless of citizenship. The TVPA specifies circumstances of human trafficking, which includes, but is not limited to, unlawful conduct with respect to documents, involuntary servitude, visa fraud, importing aliens for immoral purposes, sex trafficking by force, fraud or coercion, or sex trafficking of children. Next, we will go over the Mann Act of 1910, which stipulates litigation as it is applied to the transportation of minors or adults with the intent to engage in any illicit sexual activity. It also includes coercion and enticement as they apply to prostitution or any criminal activity. The Mann Act does not require proof of force, fraud, or coercion, but only proof that transportation with the intent of sexual encounter occurred. Next is the RICO statute. In practice, this statute allows prosecutors to charge members of organized crime who had not physically committed the crime, but had either ordered it or had some part in arranging the circumstances of the offense. The RICO statute also allows the prosecution to seize assets gained through the racketeering offense, helping to defund criminal organizations. Because sex trafficking is a common practice among organized criminal networks, this statute has allowed prosecutors to bring charges against anyone who participates in or facilitated trafficking. Anyone who can be linked in some way to the incident of trafficking, such as hotel owners or truck drivers, are able to be charged and have their assets seized. An additional act frequently used is the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act of 2015. The JVTA of 2015 improves the U.S. response to human trafficking. It contains a number of important amendments that strengthen services for victims. Among these amendments are changes in the criminal liability of buyers of commercial sex from victims of trafficking, the creation of a survivor-led U.S. Adversary Council on Human Trafficking, and the new directive for the implementation of a national strategy for combating human trafficking. Furthermore, the JVTA also requires the creation of a domestic trafficking victim fund to support victim assistance programs, block grants for children trafficking deterrence programs, and additional training requirements for first responders, among others. Notably, the JVTA amended the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, RHYA, by declaring youth who are victims of severe forms of trafficking in persons are eligible for services under the RHYA. It also amended the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, CAPTA, by adding human trafficking and child pornography as a form of child abuse. Major types of trafficking. For starters, sex trade/trafficking. This is the most common and well-known form of trafficking. This is trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, including sexual slavery. A victim is forced into a situation of dependency on their trafficker and then used by said trafficker to give sexual services to customers. Sex trafficking occurs when a person is forced to perform a sexual act by means of force, fraud, or coercion, or when a minor is induced to perform commercial sex regardless of whether there is any force, fraud, or coercion. A commercial sex act can be any sexual activity done in exchange for an item of value such as money, food, drugs, or shelter. Sex traffickers lure and compel people into commercial sex by manipulating and exploiting their vulnerabilities, often using force, threats, lies, and other psychological coercion. In 2015, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center NHTRC responded to over 5,500 cases of human trafficking. Of those cases, 75% involved sex trafficking. Another major type of trafficking is forced labor. Labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery. Labor trafficking is less visible and severely underreported when compared to sex trafficking and affects more foreign victims than sex trafficking. Forced labor is motivated by greed and profit. Labor trafficking capitalizes on occupation where vulnerable workers, such as immigrants, work under threat and inhumane conditions. The third major type of trafficking is bonded labor trafficking. Bonded labor happens when people give themselves into slavery against a loan or when they inherit a debt from a relative. It can be made to look like an employment agreement, but one where the worker starts with a debt to repay, only to find that repayment of the loan is impossible. Then their enslavement becomes permanent. U.S. law prohibits the use of a debt or similar threat of financial harm as a form of coercion for forced labor. The earliest U.S. legislation outlawed bonded labor under its Spanish name peonage, which surged following the legal emancipation of the U.S. slaves in 1865. Debt bondage is one of the most common forms of contemporary slavery worldwide. How does trafficking come about? This is a global issue that has just recently started acquiring Americans' attention. Traffickers prey on the weak and target low-income communities. Worldwide, false promises are a way in which traffickers bait and enslave their victims, both adults and minors. Those who live in poverty are typically economically and politically marginalized, thus most lacking rights and access to basic services such as education, which make them particularly vulnerable to sex trafficking. Many people from these communities are offered false employment opportunities in major cities. Some traffickers operate under a guise of business agencies such as construction and agriculture for men, and as models, nannies, waitresses, and dancers for women. However, upon arrival to these businesses, these individuals are abused, threatened, and sold in the sex industries. Often, traffickers keep their victims under their control by saying that they'll be free after they pay their debts. The debt is supposedly incurred from the victim's recruitment, transportation, upkeep, or even their crude sale. Thus, sex trafficking may occur within debt bonded labor. Victims of sex trafficking may eventually perform their functions. In addition to being forced sex workers, some traffickers use sex trafficking victims to recruit or transport other victims. Human trafficking is punishable under state law in Texas by a prison sentence of up to 5 years, or if the victim was under the age of 18, by a state prison sentence of up to 8 years. A general rule, a child sex trafficking conviction is a first-degree felony in the state of Texas. A defendant can receive a sentence of 5 years to life in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Each sex trafficking case is unique, and therefore prosecutors and attorneys must take a number of factors into consideration, such as the strength and availability of corroborating evidence, the severity of the offense, the victim's level of trauma and ability to retell his or her story, statutes of limitation, and the jury's interpretation of the events or behaviors. Not all cases of sex trafficking are prosecuted using human trafficking statutes. Sex trafficking frequently coincides with a variety of other crimes, allowing prosecutors to file charges based on whichever claim has the strongest evidence and will carry the highest penalty. The first famous case I will go over is United States versus Mondragon et al. Of 2006. This incident occurred in Texas. Oscar Mondragon and 7 other defendants were part of a scheme to smuggle Central American women and girls into the United States. The defendants lured their victims with promises of legal jobs in the United States. Once in the country, however, the victims were forced to work in restaurants, bars, and cantinas in the Houston area, and in some instances were required to provide commercial sex acts to customers. The women were threatened with physical harm or harm to their families if they attempted to escape before paying off their smuggling debt, and some were sexually assaulted by the defendants. The money the women made was turned over to the defendants to pay off their debts. The defendants pleaded guilty to conspiracy to hold persons in a condition of peonage, conspiracy to illegally and knowingly recruit, harbor, transport, provide, and obtain persons for labor and services, harboring an alien, and forced labor. The defendants received sentences of up to 180 months in prison and were required to pay $1,715,588 in restitution. The next famous case is State of Florida versus Andres Juanos Vaz of 2015 in Florida. Voss and 2 others convinced gay Hungarian men ages 20 to 22 to come to the United States under false promises of jobs and good pay. The defendants then brought the young men to Miami, Florida, where they forced the victims to engage in commercial sex entirely for their own profit, working up to 20 hours a day. The traffickers isolated the victims from each other, confiscated their travel and identification documents, kept them confined to the apartment, and used financial manipulation to keep the victims from leaving or seeking help. The traffickers monitored their communications with family and with others. Voss was found guilty of human trafficking, of an adult deriving support from prostitution, racketeering, conspiracy, and RICO. He was sentenced to 11 years in state prison. This was before stricter laws had been put in place regarding human trafficking laws in Florida. My last famous case is United States versus Fields, 2013 in Florida. Andrew Blaine Fields sold drugs such as oxycodone, diluted, and morphine to numerous young women, causing addiction and dependency. Fields preyed on young, vulnerable women and recruited them by promising to help them get off the streets. He then forced them into commercial sex to pay off their drug debt. He coerced the victims to engage in commercial sex by threatening to withdraw the drugs and subject them to painful and debilitating withdrawal symptoms. He harbored some of the victims in his trailer home in the Tampa Bay area. Fields was convicted of 5 counts of sex trafficking by force, fraud, and coercion, and additionally narcotics-related offenses. He received a sentence of 34 years of imprisonment. This is my resource and site page. Thank you. Have a great day.